The operations room never truly slept. Even at 200, it breathed monitors casting pale blue light across tired faces, radios whispering in overlapping frequencies, the smell of burnt coffee permanently soaked into the walls. For most people stationed at Fob Kestrel, the night shift was routine, background noise, something to endure until sunrise. But Staff Sergeant Maya Reyes wasn't most people. She had been at her station for 11 straight hours, headset on, eyes moving between 3 screens simultaneously. Most analysts worked one feed at a time. Maya worked them like a chess player, always 3 moves ahead, always watching for the pattern inside the pattern. It was a habit she developed not in training, but in childhood, growing up in a small Texas border town where reading a room quietly was sometimes the only thing that kept you safe. Tonight, something was wrong. She couldn't name it yet. It lived in the back of her skull like a frequency just below hearing, a pressure, a wrongness humming steadily beneath all the routine noise of the base. Then she found it. A fragmented transmission on a frequency her team had flagged as dormant 3 weeks ago. Enemy networks rotated channels constantly. It was standard counter-surveillance practice. But this frequency had gone quiet so abruptly that Maya had made a personal note about it at the time. Dormant channels didn't just go quiet. They got replaced. And when they came back, it usually meant something had changed in the operational picture. The transmission lasted 4 seconds, broken, layered in interference. 3 words survived the static clearly enough to be logged. Valley route confirmed. Maya sat very still. She pulled the audio file and ran it through the enhancement filter twice. The words didn't change. She cross-referenced the frequency against the last 72 hours of signals traffic and found 2 other microtransmissions she had initially coded as atmospheric interference. Now, in context, they looked deliberate, timed, structured. Someone had been using this channel carefully, in short bursts, specifically to avoid triggering automated detection thresholds. This wasn't careless chatter. This was operational coordination. She began building the assessment at 2100 and didn't stop until midnight. By the time she was done, she had 14 pages, intercept logs, frequency analysis, geographic mapping of probable transmission origin points, and a threat projection model that pointed to a single, deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Enemy elements were positioning along the Chronicles Valley route. Not wandering, not probing, positioning, with intent, with patience. With the kind of deliberate preparation that suggested they knew something was coming through that valley and were getting ready to meet it. She printed 2 copies, walked to Major Dalton's office, and slid one under his door. She placed the second directly on the duty officer's desk with a verbal summary. Then she went back to her station and waited. By 600, the assessment had been reviewed. By 610, it had been stamped inconclusive, insufficient corroboration and filed. Major Dalton called her into his office at 6:30. He was a broad-shouldered man from Ohio who had been running intelligence operations for 14 years and wore his experience like armor. He respected competence. He did not particularly enjoy being told he'd missed something. He leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers together, and looked at her the way a patient teacher looks at an overeager student. "Reyes," he said, "you're reading ghosts. One fragmented intercept on a dead channel isn't a threat assessment. It's a hypothesis. You need corroborating signals, ground confirmation, or pattern-of-life data over at least a 96-hour window before this becomes actionable." She stood at parade rest and kept her voice level. "Sir, the transmission pattern itself is the corroboration. The deliberate burst structure, the dormant channel reactivation, the geographic clustering of origin points, taken together, this indicates coordinated pre-operational movement." Dalton's expression didn't change. Noted, dismissed. She walked out. The hallway felt longer than usual. She passed a bulletin board with a photo of last month's successful resupply mission. Soldiers grinning, thumbs up, the Chronicles Valley visible in the background like a postcard. Back at her station, She put her headset on and pulled up the frequency again. It was stronger now, cleaner, more confident. Whoever was transmitting had stopped being careful. And that, Maya knew from 6 years of listening to enemies who thought no one was paying attention, meant only one thing. They were almost ready. The briefing room at Fob Kestrel held 30 people comfortably. At 600 it held 42, standing shoulder to shoulder, the air already thick with body heat and the particular tension that precedes a mission order. Maps covered every wall. A large terrain display dominated the front of the room, the Chronicles Valley rendered in topographic detail, ridgelines, elevation markers, route overlays drawn in clean military red. Maya stood at the back. She had not been invited. She had come anyway. Lieutenant Colonel James Harwick was not a careless man. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. He was decorated, experienced, and genuinely devoted to the soldiers under his command. He had served 3 combat tours, survived an IED strike in Fallujah that had killed 2 men in the vehicle ahead of him, and had built a reputation as an officer who made clean decisions under pressure. His problem was not recklessness. His problem was certainty. He had been right enough times that the possibility of being wrong had slowly, quietly, stopped feeling real. He stepped to the terrain display at exactly 6:02 and began. The mission was straightforward on paper. 12 soldiers, 4 vehicles, 2 Humvees and 2 MRAPs, carrying 800 kilograms of medical supplies, surgical equipment and water purification tablets to the village of Daletkel, approximately 40 kilometers northeast through the Chronicles Valley. The village had been cut off from coalition resupply for 3 weeks due to weather and shifting security conditions. People were sick. Children were sick. The mission had moral weight, and everyone in that room felt it. Harwick traced the route with a laser pointer, moving smoothly along the valley road like he was drawing a line on a classroom chalkboard. Clean, logical, efficient. The pointer traveled through the exact 2-kilometer stretch Maya had mentally labeled the throat, the narrowest section of the valley, high ground on both sides, natural choke point geometry that any trained ambush commander would recognize instantly as a gift. Maya raised her hand. Harwick glanced at her briefly, registered her presence with mild surprise, and continued talking about vehicle spacing and radio protocols. She kept her hand up. The junior officer to her left, a young lieutenant named Cho who had been at the base for 6 weeks, leaned close and whispered, "Sergeant, don't." She looked at him. His expression wasn't dismissive. It was genuinely nervous on her behalf. He knew what happened to analysts who interrupted Harwick's briefings with unvetted concerns. She had heard the stories too. She lowered her hand, but her jaw tightened and stayed that way. Harwick moved through the briefing with the efficiency of a man who had given 100 versions of this same speech. Departure time, 800 the following morning. Expected transit time, 4 hours including checkpoint stops. Air support, on call but not dedicated due to a concurrent operation in the Kunar province pulling 2 Apache crews. That detail landed in Maya's chest like a stone dropping into deep water. On call, not dedicated. Meaning if something happened in that valley, there would be a response gap, and response gaps in ambush scenarios were measured in lives. She stood at the back of that room and did the math she did not want to do. The throat of the valley, 2.1 kilometers of zero escape geometry. An on-call air asset with a minimum 12-minute response window due to the radar shadow. 4 vehicles that could not turn around quickly in a confined road. 12 soldiers who trusted the intelligence picture they had been given. And a warning sitting in a filing cabinet stamped inconclusive. The briefing ended at 6:40. Soldiers filed out, talking quietly, checking gear lists, making the small rituals of men and women who understood that preparation was the only prayer that reliably worked. Maya stayed until the room was nearly empty, staring at the terrain display, at that red line running through the throat of the valley like a slow fuse. 18 hours. That was what she had. Departure was 800 tomorrow, and it was not yet 700 today. She thought about going back to Major Dalton. She had already run that calculation and knew the answer. He had dismissed her once with 14 pages of documented analysis. A second visit with the same data would not produce a different result. It would produce a formal reprimand and possibly removal from the rotation. She needed something he couldn't dismiss. Something that didn't live in a frequency analysis or a signals log. Something visual, undeniable, impossible to stamp inconclusive and file away. She needed to see that valley herself. She left the briefing room walking fast, mind already moving toward the UAV bay, toward a conversation she hadn't had yet with a specialist who stayed late and asked few questions. 18 hours. She wasn't going to waste a single one. The UAV bay sat at the eastern edge of Fob Kestrel, separated from the main operations buildings by a stretch of gravel and 2 rows of blast barriers. It was not a glamorous place. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the persistence of insects. The smell of hydraulic fluid and solder hung permanently in the air. Equipment cases lined the walls in various states of assembly, and handwritten maintenance logs were taped to nearly every surface with the kind of obsessive organization that only people who truly loved machines bothered with. Specialist Darius Cole was crouched beneath a Predator unit's port wing at 2100, penlight clenched between his teeth, running a calibration check on the thermal imaging gimbal with the focused patience of a watchmaker. He was 23 years old, lean, with grease-stained fingers and the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly one thing in this world at a profound level, and that one thing happened to be unmanned aerial vehicles. He heard Maya's footsteps and didn't look up. "Whatever you need, Sergeant, I'm off rotation until 600. "That's exactly why I'm here," she said. He looked up then, read her face, set down his penlight slowly. Maya didn't waste time with preamble. She pulled a folded map from her jacket pocket, spread it on the nearest workbench, and walked him through it in under 4 minutes: the intercept, the dismissed assessment, the convoy order, the throat of the valley, the on-call air gap. She spoke quietly and precisely, the way she always spoke when the stakes were highest, because she had learned long ago that urgency communicated itself most effectively through stillness. When she finished, Darius was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map. Then he looked at the Predator unit behind him, a fully operational bird, freshly serviced, sitting on its ground cradle with the patient readiness of a hunting hawk. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "is an unauthorized reconnaissance flight over a designated mission corridor without command approval." "I'm describing a routine systems test flight," Maya said, "over Grid Sector 7, which happens to overlap with the Valley Corridor, which we would document thoroughly for maintenance records." Darius studied her for a long moment. "And if the flight produces imagery that turns out to be operationally significant, then it gets walked directly to command before 800 tomorrow," she said, "with full documentation of how it was obtained. And if it produces nothing, then we ran a systems test and caught nothing, and I file a maintenance note and go back to being the analyst who reads ghosts." He exhaled through his nose, looked at the Predator again, then back at her. "If this goes sideways," he said, "I'm blamming you completely." She almost smiled. "Deal." He had the drone prepped and cleared for launch in 40 minutes, a testament to how well he knew that machine. Every pre-flight check executed with methodical speed, no corners cut, because Darius Cole understood that a drone that failed mid-flight over hostile terrain was worse than no drone at all. Maya sat beside him at the ground control station, watching the checklist move with barely contained impatience, forcing herself to breathe slowly. At 22:08, the Predator lifted off the pad in near silence and climbed into the Afghan night. At 15,000 feet, it leveled off and banked northeast toward the Korangal Valley. On the ground control screen, the terrain below resolved into shades of gray and black, a cold, indifferent landscape of rock and shadow. Darius flew with relaxed precision, one hand resting on the control stick, eyes soft-focused on the feed the way experienced pilots learn to watch, not at one point, but across the whole frame simultaneously. The valley appeared on screen at 2241. Even in standard imaging it looked forbidding, narrow walls rising steeply on both sides, the road at the bottom reduced to a pale thread winding through darkness. Maya leaned forward slightly. Take her down to 12,000 and toggle thermal. Darius adjusted altitude and hit the thermal filter. The screen changed. For 2 full seconds neither of them spoke. Maya's hand gripped the edge of the console without her realizing it, because the valley that had looked empty, cold, dead, abandoned, was suddenly alive with heat. Dozens of signatures, pressed flat against the ridgelines, tucked into rock formations, concealed beneath what the system identified as thermal-suppressing material camouflage netting, specifically designed to defeat exactly the kind of imaging they were running. But no netting was perfect. Body heat leaked at the edges. Breath rose in thin infrared wisps. And positioned across both ridgelines in a precise L-shaped formation that no shepherd, no farmer, no innocent traveler would ever accidentally form. 31 individual heat signatures waited in perfect ambush geometry. Maya felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the base's air conditioning. She had been right. She had been right, and 14 pages of documented analysis hadn't been enough, and a mission briefing had proceeded anyway, and 12 soldiers were scheduled to drive directly into this in less than 10 hours. Record everything, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Every frame, every timestamp, don't miss a single signature. Darius was already recording. His jaw was tight. He made 3 slow passes over the valley, varying altitude and angle, building a complete thermal picture from multiple perspectives. He didn't speak during any of it. There was nothing useful to say. On the 4th pass, one of the heat signatures shifted, just slightly, a body adjusting position after hours of stillness. It was such a small movement, barely a pixel's worth of change on the screen, but it told Maya everything she needed to know. They were real, they were patient, and they had been lying there, waiting in the cold Afghan dark for a very long time. She grabbed Darius by the arm, not urgently, deliberately. The way you grab someone when you need them to understand the full weight of what comes next. Get me every frame in a single package, she said. Compressed, time-stamped, and cross-referenced to grid coordinates. I need it ready in 2 hours. Where are you going? He asked. She was already standing, already moving toward the door. To build something nobody can ignore. Maya didn't go back to the barracks. She didn't eat. She didn't consider either of those things. She went straight to her station, pulled the drive Darius had handed her, and plugged it in with the focused intensity of a surgeon opening a chest cavity, knowing that everything that mattered was about to be exposed under the light. The footage loaded in 37 seconds. 37 seconds during which she sat completely still, hands flat on the desk, eyes on the progress bar, breathing through her nose. When the files opened, she didn't start with the video. She started with the raw thermal coordinate data, because data didn't lie, couldn't be dismissed as interpretation, couldn't be stamped inconclusive by a man who simply didn't want to be wrong. She built the package in layers. First layer, the thermal imagery itself, timestamp locked to GPS coordinates, every heat signature individually mapped and numbered. 31 bodies across 2 ridgelines. She cross-referenced their positions against standard ambush doctrine, and the match was nearly perfect. A textbook L-shaped formation, the long axis running parallel to the road, the short axis positioned to close the kill zone from the northern approach. Whoever had set this up knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't improvised, this was studied. Second layer, her original intercept data from 36 hours prior. She overlaid the transmission origin points against the drone coordinates and found what she had suspected, but hadn't yet been able to prove. 3 of the Intercept origin clusters fell within 200 meters of the heaviest signature concentrations on the ridgelines. The people transmitting Valley Route confirmed, and the people lying in ambush position were, in all probability, the same people. The signals intelligence and the imagery intelligence were telling the same story from different angles. Third layer timeline reconstruction. She built a chronological sequence showing when each piece of data had been collected, when her assessment had been submitted, when it had been dismissed, and when the convoy order had been issued. Laid out in sequence, the timeline read like an indictment, not of any single person's malice, but of a system that had processed a credible warning and discarded it inside 8 hours without secondary verification. She worked without stopping for 3 hours and 14 minutes. At 1:30 she sat back and looked at what she had built. It was 14 pages before. Now it was 41: intercept logs, frequency analysis, thermal imagery, coordinate mapping, timeline reconstruction, and a 2-page executive summary written in the blunt, unambiguous language she reserved for moments when clarity mattered more than diplomacy. She printed 2 copies, put both in a manila folder, and picked up the drive. Then she walked to Lieutenant Colonel Harwick's quarters. The base at 1:30 was as quiet as it ever got, a few sentries, a few insomniacs, the distant sound of a generator running somewhere beyond the motor pool. Her boots on the gravel path were the loudest thing in her immediate world. She passed the bulletin board with the Chronicles Valley photograph again. This time she didn't look at it. Harwick's aide, a young corporal named Sims, who drew the unfortunate duty of night watch outside the Co's quarters, stepped forward as she approached. "Sergeant, the colonel is." "I need 60 seconds of his time," Maya said. She kept walking. Sims moved to intercept her, and she looked at him with an expression that had ended considerably more ambitious obstruction attempts than a tired corporal at 1:30. He stepped aside. She knocked 3 times, firm, not frantic, the knock of someone who was certain, not panicked. A long pause, then the sound of movement. The door opened and Harwick stood there in a plain t-shirt and patrol trousers, hair pressed flat on one side, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a man interrupted from sleep or paperwork or both. His expression carried the specific irritation of a senior officer whose personal space had been entered without invitation. He looked at her, then at the folder, then back at her face. Something in her expression gave him pause. In 14 years of operational command, Harwick had developed an instinct for the difference between an analyst with a theory and an analyst with a fact. Maya Reyes was not standing at his door at 1:30 with a theory. He took the folder without a word. "Sir," she said quietly, "I need you to look at page 3 first, then the drive." He opened the folder, found page 3, the thermal imagery composite, all 31 signatures mapped and numbered across both ridgelines, the convoy route drawn in red directly through the center of the kill zone. He studied it for 11 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "Come with me." The operations center came alive in under 4 minutes. Lights snapped on. Duty officers materialized. The main briefing screen flickered and loaded as Harwick plugged in the drive himself, standing at the console in his t-shirt with the quiet authority of a man who had stopped caring what he looked like the moment the footage began to play. The room watched in silence as the thermal feed rolled, that valley floor cold and dark, and then the filter toggle, and then the ridgelines erupting with heat signatures. 31 bodies patient and waiting in the Afghan dark, positioned with lethal geometric precision around a road that 12 American soldiers were scheduled to travel in less than 7 hours. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone present is simultaneously doing the same mental calculation and arriving at the same answer. Major Dalton stood at the back of the room. Maya did not look at him. Harwick's voice, when it came, was controlled and quiet and carried the particular weight of a man recalibrating everything. "How long have they been in position?" Maya answered without hesitation. At least 72 hours, sir, possibly longer. They were positioned before we issued the convoy order. The room processed that. Harwick set his coffee cup down on the console with a soft, final sound, the sound of a certainty being permanently retired. "Get me the QRF commander," he said, "and somebody halt that advance element. Right now." The operations center transformed in seconds. What had been a quiet night rotation of 4 duty officers and 2 radio operators became something else entirely. Controlled, urgent, and moving with the particular energy of people who understood that minutes were no longer abstract units of time but measurable quantities of human survival. Harwick issued the emergency halt order at 4:48. His voice was calm. Commanders who had seen real combat learned that calm was not the opposite of urgency. It was urgency's most effective vehicle. Every word he spoke landed clean and clear, no wasted syllables, no emotional static. Full convoy halt. All elements stand down pending intelligence update. QRF to staging. Air assets on immediate standby. The duty officers moved. Radio operators hit their channels simultaneously. The room filled with the layered sound of multiple transmissions running at once. A controlled chaos that Maya had learned to read like music, tracking 4 conversations simultaneously, her mind sorting signal from noise the way it always had, since childhood, since always. But then the first problem surfaced. "Sir," radio operator specialist Torres turned from his console with an expression that nobody in an operations center ever wanted to see, the look of someone delivering news that made a bad situation geometrically worse. "Advance element isn't responding. Channel 7 is breaking up. Looks like the antenna replacement last night. The new unit may have a calibration fault." Harwick crossed the room in 4 strides. "Get me their last confirmed position." Torres pulled it up. The advance element, 2 Humvees carrying 4 soldiers total, Sergeant Luis Vargas commanding, had checked in at Checkpoint Alpha at 4:31, 17 minutes ago. Standard procedure was to pre-clear the first 2 kilometers of route before the main column moved, which meant right now, Vargas and his 3 soldiers were somewhere in the approach corridor to the valley, possibly already near the throat. Maya was already at the main console pulling up the drone feed. Darius had kept the Predator on station, bless him, she thought, bless his professional stubbornness, and the bird was still circling at 12,000 feet above the valley. She toggled thermal and the ridgelines lit up immediately. 31 signatures still in position, patient, waiting. But something had changed in their geometry, a tightening, a compression toward the valley mouth, like a hand slowly closing into a fist. They had heard something, or sensed something. The ambush was beginning to activate. "I have movement in the signature cluster at grid 447, Maya said, keeping her voice level. "North Ridge element is shifting toward the valley entrance. They may be picking up vehicle noise from the advance element." Harwick turned to the air liaison officer. "Where are my Apache?" "Banked and climbing, sir. 8 minutes to station." 8 minutes. Maya ran the math without being asked. If Vargas's Humvees were maintaining standard approach speed and had left Checkpoint Alpha 17 minutes ago, they were approximately 2.3 kilometers from the valley mouth. At current speed, they would reach the kill zone entrance in roughly 4 minutes. The Apache were 8 minutes out. That was a 4-minute gap between when the ambush would trigger and when air support would arrive. 4 minutes in a properly executed L-shaped ambush against 2 lightly armored Humvees was not a gap. It was a death sentence. She grabbed the primary radio handset before anyone told her to. All elements, this is Kestrel operations. Advance element Kestrel 2, do you copy? Over, static." She adjusted the frequency manually, running through the 3 backup channels in sequence. "Kestrel 2, this is Kestrel operations, please respond. Over, more static. A fragment of something, a carrier wave, maybe, or interference from the valley's terrain masking the signal." "There in the shadow corridor," Torres said quietly. The valley's rock walls created a natural radio dead zone for approximately 800 meters before the throat. Standard communications degraded to near zero in that stretch. Everyone in the room knew it. Nobody said what it meant. Maya didn't stop transmitting. She worked through every channel, every frequency, every technical workaround she knew, her voice remaining steady and professional even as her heart ran at a rate that had nothing to do with professional composure. Around her, the room continued its controlled storm. Harwick coordinating the QRF departure, the air liaison talking to the Apache flight lead, duty officers pulling up contingency fire support maps. The QRF convoy, 8 soldiers in 2 MRAPs, rolled out of the staging area at 4:51, moving at maximum safe speed on a dirt road that rewarded aggression with broken axles. Their ETA to the valley mouth was 11 minutes under ideal conditions. The conditions were not ideal. At 4:53, the thermal feed showed the North Ridge signature cluster complete its shift. 31 bodies, fully repositioned, the L formation oriented and locked toward the valley entrance with the finality of a trap fully set and ready to spring. And then, through the static, barely audible, broken into syllables by interference and distance, and a faulty antenna calibration, a voice. Kestrel operations, receiving you broken, say again your last, over. Vargas, it was Vargas. Maya's grip on the handset tightened until her knuckles went pale. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the absolute measured clarity of someone who understood that the next 10 words she transmitted might be the most important 10 words she would ever speak in her life. Kestrel 2, this is Kestrel operations. Listen carefully. A burst of static, then go ahead. Turn around. Now ambush valley mouth. Execute immediate reversal. Do you copy? 3 seconds of silence stretched across the operations center like a physical thing. Every person in the room suspended in it. Nobody breathing. Nobody moving. The only sound the soft electronic hiss of an open radio channel carrying nothing but distance and static, and the enormous weight of what happened next. Then Vargas's voice, clear for just a moment through the interference, the single most important transmission of the entire night. Copy that, revering, out. The room exhaled, but Maya was already back on the drone feed, watching the thermal signatures on the North Ridge begin to move with sudden, agitated urgency. The unhurried patience of a perfect ambush dissolving into the sharp, reactive energy of fighters whose window was closing. They knew. The element of surprise was slipping through their fingers like sand, and they knew it. She keyed the air liaison channel immediately. Ambush element is activating. North Ridge signatures mobile. Request immediate Apache weapons free on grid 447 the moment they reach station. Harwick's voice came from directly behind her. Authorized. 7 minutes until the Apache arrived. Vargas was revering. The ambush was activating early. And somewhere in the dark throat of the Koringal Valley, 4 soldiers in 2 Humvees were driving as fast as a dirt road would allow away from 31 armed men who had just realized their carefully constructed killing ground was about to become something else entirely. Maya kept her eyes on the thermal feed and did not look away for a single second. Because it wasn't over, not even close, the first shot came at 4:57. Maya saw it on the thermal feed before anyone heard the radio report, a muzzle flash blooming white-hot on the North Ridgeline, there and gone in a fraction of a second, followed immediately by 3 more in rapid succession. The ambush had triggered early, the way ambushes always triggered when the element of surprise began slipping, not with the controlled precision of a perfectly executed plan, but with the desperate urgency of fighters who understood that their window was closing and chose to act rather than lose everything by waiting. Vargas's rear Humvee was 340 meters from the valley mouth when the fire opened up. The radio erupted. Contact! Contact north! Taking fire, RPG! Then a sound that needed no translation, the compressed, percussive crack of a rocket-propelled grenade detonating close enough to shake the transmission into fragments. Torres was already broadcasting emergency traffic on every channel. Harwick was on the air liaison frequency, his voice carrying the controlled ferocity of a man pushing assets to move faster than physics comfortably allowed. Maya watched the thermal feed with the focus of someone who had no other tool available and understood that right now, the drone overhead was the single most comprehensive eye on that battlefield. She narrated in real time, her voice a steady instrument in a room full of noise. Rear Humvee has stopped. I'm reading 4 dismounts, they're taking cover behind the vehicle. North Ridge element advancing, approximately 9 signatures moving down slope toward the road. Lead Humvee is stationary approximately 60 meters ahead. I count 2 heat signatures still inside, possible casualties or taking cover. Apache Flight ETA, Harwick snapped. 6 minutes, sir. 6 minutes. Maya kept her eyes on the screen and did the brutal arithmetic that nobody wanted to do out loud. 4 soldiers behind a stalled Humvee. 9 fighters moving down a ridgeline toward them. A kill zone designed specifically to prevent escape or reinforcement. 6 minutes of unsupported contact in those conditions was not a tactical problem. It was a survival problem. But Vargas wasn't dying quietly. The radio feed carried fragments of what was happening in real time, controlled bursts of M4 fire. Vargas's voice cutting through the chaos with the sharp authority of a sergeant who had trained for exactly this, and refused to let training become eulogy. OKAFOR, left side, TANAKA suppress that ridge, VARGAS on the gun. The Humvee's M240 machine gun opened up with a sound that reached the operations center as a deep, rhythmic thunder even through the radio compression. And on Maya's thermal feed, she watched 2 of the 9 advancing signatures stop moving and drop flat. Vargas was buying time, burning ammunition and will and the particular fierce energy of a man who had decided he was not going to be remembered as someone who died confused and unprepared on a road he should never have been on. He was buying 6 minutes. Maya shifted her focus to the southern ridgeline. The secondary ambush element, 12 signatures that had remained stationary throughout, was beginning to stir. If they moved to close the valley mouth completely, the Humvees would be encircled. She keyed her channel immediately. South Ridge element activating, 12 signatures mobile, moving toward valley entrance to complete encirclement. QRF needs to know, the valley mouth will be contested in approximately 3 minutes. The QRF commander's voice came back immediate and hard. Copy, adjusting approach, coming in from the Eastern Service track. Smart. The Eastern Service track added 90 seconds to their approach, but kept them outside the Southern element's field of fire until the last possible moment. Maya pulled up the terrain overlay and confirmed the route was passable for MRAPs. It was. Barely. She relayed the confirmation without being asked. At 5:01, the first Apache arrived on station. The sound reached the valley before the aircraft was visible. A deep, mechanical thunder rolling down between the rock walls, the unmistakable voice of a rotary-wing gunship announcing itself to everyone below with the authority of something that could not be argued with. On the thermal feed, Maya watched the advancing North Ridge element freeze. 9 men, halfway down a slope, suddenly very aware that the geometry of the situation had changed completely. The Apache's pilot came over the air liaison channel, voice professionally flat. Kestrel operations, Warhorse 1-1 on station. I have visual on North Ridge element, requesting clearance hot. Warhorse 1-1, Kestrel operations, you are cleared hot. Grid 447, positively identified enemy element. Friendlies at valley mouth, eastern side of road. Watch your southern boundary. Copy, rolling in. The gun run lasted 11 seconds. On the thermal feed, it was a clinical thing. The Apache banking hard, the chain gun firing in a precise controlled burst, and the North Ridgeline erupting in a cascade of heat and movement, and then sudden, absolute stillness where 9 advancing signatures had been. The L formation that had been designed with such patient expertise to destroy 12 American soldiers dissolved in under a quarter minute of precision fire. The second Apache arrived 20 seconds later and took the southern ridgeline element under fire as they attempted to scatter back into the high ground. The encirclement that had been 3 minutes from completion never closed. The QRF MRAPs hit the valley mouth at 5:04, dismounting soldiers in a disciplined perimeter sweep that secured the disabled Humvee and established a casualty collection point in under 90 seconds. Maya watched it all on the thermal feed, the organized movement of trained soldiers doing exactly what they had been trained to do, the chaos of the ambush collapsing into the structured geometry of a recovery operation. Then the casualty reports started coming in. Corporal Brett Tanaka, shrapnel from the initial RPG detonation, right shoulder, bleeding controlled, conscious and alert. Private First Class Deshaun Okafor, blast concussion from the same detonation, disoriented but responsive, no penetrating trauma. Sergeant Luis Vargas, gunshot wound, left thigh, entry and exit, tourniquet applied by his own hand in the first 30 seconds of contact, because Luis Vargas was precisely the kind of soldier who applied his own tourniquet and kept firing afterward. 3 wounded, 0 killed. Maya read the casualty report on her screen and sat very still for a moment. 3 names. 3 men who had driven into the edge of something that should have consumed them completely and had come back damaged but breathing and whole enough to be angry about it later. She thought about the 17 minutes, the gap between when the advance element rolled out and when the halt order reached them. 17 minutes that she had not been able to close. 17 minutes that had cost Tanaka a shoulder full of metal, and Okafor a head that would ring for weeks, and Vargas a thigh wound that would leave a scar he'd carry for the rest of his life. She was glad they were alive. She was grateful down to the molecular level that they were alive. But she did not feel victorious. She felt the weight of those 17 minutes pressing down on her with the specific gravity of things that could not be undone, only carried forward, carefully, as a permanent reminder of what happened when warnings went unheard and time ran out before anyone decided to listen. Outside the operations center, the Afghan dawn was beginning, pale light spreading slowly across the base, indifferent and ancient and utterly unmoved by what had just happened in the valley to the northeast. Maya turned back to her console. The drone was still on station. She kept watching. The inquiry convened 48 hours after the contact. Not because the army moved slowly. It didn't, when the subject matter was sufficiently uncomfortable, but because 48 hours was the minimum time required to gather every relevant document, recall every relevant person, and construct the kind of formal framework that transformed a near catastrophe into a proceeding with rules and procedures and the institutional appearance of order. The inquiry board consisted of 5 people. Colonel Adrian Marsh from the brigade's Inspector General office, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent 20 years listening to people explain why things had gone wrong. A JAG lawyer named Captain Reeves who took notes with mechanical precision and asked questions that sounded simple until you were halfway through answering them. A Pentagon intelligence liaison, GS-15 civilian named Garrett, who had flown in from Bagram with a laptop full of comparative incident data and the practiced neutrality of someone paid to have no opinion until the facts were complete. And 2 senior officers from the brigade whose names Maya had been told and immediately categorized as institutional presence, people there to ensure the proceeding carried appropriate command weight. They met in Conference Room B, which was the base's way of saying the second largest room available that wasn't currently being used for something that mattered more. Folding tables arranged in a rectangle, a projector screen on the far wall, water pitchers nobody touched, the particular fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Major Dalton was first. Maya was not present for his testimony. Witnesses were sequestered between sessions, standard procedure. But the account that filtered back through the base's informal intelligence network, which was considerably faster and more reliable than any official channel, was that Dalton had arrived composed and left looking like a man who had spent 90 minutes discovering that every answer he thought he had was actually a question. Colonel Marsh, by all accounts, had a gift for that. The central problem Dalton faced was not malice. Nobody was suggesting malice. The problem was documented indifference, a paper trail that showed a 14-page threat assessment received, reviewed, and dismissed inside 8 hours without secondary verification, without consultation with a second analyst, and without any notation explaining the analytical basis for the inconclusive determination beyond a single line in a duty log. In the language of military intelligence protocol, that wasn't a judgment call. It was a procedural failure wearing the costume of a judgment call. Dalton's defense, that one fragmented intercept on a dormant channel did not meet the evidentiary threshold for actionable threat assessment, was technically defensible in isolation. The inquiry board's job was to demonstrate that it did not exist in isolation. It existed in a context that included corroborating signals data, geographic clustering, dormant channel reactivation patterns, and an analyst with 6 years of signals intelligence experience who had documented all of it in writing and submitted it through proper channels at midnight. Lieutenant Colonel Harwick came next. His session lasted 4 hours. Harwick was a different case from Dalton, not because his culpability was greater in the procedural sense, but because his position carried greater responsibility and he understood that clearly. He did not deflect. He did not construct elaborate defenses. He answered every question directly, acknowledged every decision point where a different choice might have altered the outcome, and accepted the board's findings with the quiet dignity of a man who had decided before walking into that room that honesty was the only exit worth taking. He received a formal letter of reprimand, not career-ending, but permanent, a notation in his record that would follow him to every future command review. He accepted it standing, signed the acknowledgement form without reading it twice, and walked out of conference room looking like a man who had made peace with something heavy and was now prepared to carry it without complaint. The brigade's intelligence assessment protocols were suspended pending comprehensive review. Every active threat assessment in the system was pulled and reevaluated by a 2-analyst team. New procedures were drafted requiring mandatory secondary review for any assessment involving dormant channel reactivation, a specific procedural gap that Maya's case had exposed with uncomfortable precision. Then it was Maya's turn. She had spent the 48 hours between the contact and her testimony doing what she always did when she needed to think clearly, working. She had processed 3 new Intercept packages, filed 2 routine assessments, and eaten every meal at her station because the alternative was sitting in the barracks staring at the ceiling reconstructing the timeline for the 100th time. She had spoken to Darius once, briefly, outside the UAV bay. He had looked at her with the expression of someone who had processed everything that had happened and arrived at a single, uncomplicated conclusion about it. "We did the right thing," he said. "We did an unauthorized thing," she replied. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. Then he went back inside. She walked into conference room B at 1400 on the second day, sat down across from 5 people whose job was to determine exactly what had happened and why, and folded her hands on the table. Colonel Marsh looked at her for a moment before speaking, the kind of look that was itself a form of assessment, reading posture and expression, and the small tells that documents couldn't capture. Then she said, "Sergeant Reyes, walk us through the timeline from the moment you first intercepted the transmission." Maya walked them through it, every step, every decision, every moment where she had chosen to push forward rather than accept the institutional verdict that her warning didn't matter. She did not editorialize. She did not frame her actions as heroism or her superiors' actions as negligence. She presented sequence and fact with the same precision she brought to every intelligence product she had ever produced, because she understood, at a level that went deeper than strategy, that the truth presented plainly was always more powerful than the truth presented dramatically. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Captain Reeves looked at his notes. Garrett typed something on his laptop. The two senior officers exchanged a glance that carried more information than their expressions suggested. Then Colonel Marsh said, "Thank you, Sergeant." 2 words, delivered with a weight that told Maya everything she needed to know about how the board had received what she'd given them. Outside in the hallway afterward, she stood alone for a moment against the wall, eyes closed, just breathing. The building hummed around her. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. A radio murmured something about weather over the Kunar province. She thought about Darius in the UAV bay, penlight in his teeth, building something unauthorized and necessary in the dark. She thought about Tors at the radio console, working every frequency with the persistence of someone who refused to accept static as a final answer. She thought about Vargas applying his own tourniquet in the first 30 seconds of contact, because he was exactly the kind of soldier who did not wait for someone else to save him. The system had failed, but the people inside it at the critical moment had refused to fail with it. She pushed off the wall, straightened her uniform, and walked back toward the operations room. There was still work to do. The commendation ceremony was held on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriately understated for something Maya had never asked for and didn't quite know what to do with. No parade ground, no assembled battalion standing at attention in the Afghan sun. Just the operations courtyard, a dozen people, Colonel Marsh presenting a folded certificate and a service commendation medal with the same measured gravity she brought to everything. Harwick was there. He stood at the edge of the small gathering in his dress uniform, hands clasped behind his back, and when Maya's eyes found his briefly during the presentation, he gave her a single nod, not the nod of a superior acknowledging a subordinate, but something more honest than that. The nod of a man acknowledging a debt he could never fully repay and wasn't going to insult her by pretending otherwise. Darius stood beside her during the ceremony. He had received his letter of reprimand 3 days prior, 1 page, formally worded, permanently filed. He had folded it carefully, tucked it in his breast pocket, and told Maya it was the best souvenir he'd ever collected. She had almost laughed. Almost. After the ceremony ended and the small gathering dissolved back into the base's daily rhythm, Maya stood alone in the courtyard, holding the commendation certificate in both hands, and looked at it for a long time. The language was official and precise, demonstrated exceptional initiative and analytical acuity in the prevention of significant friendly force casualties, words that were accurate in the way that photographs of landscapes were accurate, technically correct, missing everything that mattered. She thought about Corporal Brett Tanaka first. She had visited him in the medical tent the morning after the contact, before the inquiry began, before any of the institutional machinery had started turning. He had been sitting up in his cot with his right arm immobilized and a bruise running from his jaw to his collarbone, eating reconstituted eggs with his left hand, and complaining loudly that the food was worse than the shrapnel. He had looked up when she came in and said, without preamble, "You're the analyst." She had said yes. He had looked at her for a moment with the direct, undecorated assessment of a combat soldier evaluating someone he owed something to. Then he had gone back to his eggs and said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. Deshaun Akaffer had been cleared for light duty by the time she saw him, walking carefully, still dealing with the particular disorientation of a blast concussion that made bright lights feel like accusations. He had been writing a letter home when she found him. He had folded it away when she sat down across from him, and they had talked for 20 minutes about nothing significant: his hometown in Georgia, her hometown in Texas, the specific misery of forward operating base coffee, And she had understood that the conversation itself was the thing, the simple human confirmation that they were both still present and breathing and capable of talking about Georgia and Texas and terrible coffee. Luis Vargas she saved for last, because Vargas was the one who stayed with her in the way that things stay with you when they arrive attached to 17 minutes of math that still kept her awake at night. He was on a crutch when she found him outside the medical tent 3 weeks after the incident, laughing at something his buddy had said, with the full-bodied, uncomplicated laughter of a man who understood at a cellular level that laughing was something you did when you were still alive to do it. He saw her coming and straightened slightly, not out of protocol but out of instinct, the reflex of a soldier recognizing someone he associated with a significant moment. She walked up to him and didn't deliver a speech because she didn't have one. She said, "How's the leg?" He shrugged with the shoulder above the crutch. "Souvenir," he said. Then, with the directness of someone who didn't have patience for the long way around anything, "You're the one who called it." "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "My daughter's 4 years old," he said. "She doesn't know what almost means yet." He let that sit for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same honest currency Harwick had offered her at the ceremony, and turned back to his buddy. She walked back to the operations building slowly. The commendation was in her left hand. She wasn't thinking about it. She was thinking about a 4-year-old girl in wherever Vargas was from who would see her father come home from this deployment without knowing, would never need to know, how close the margin had been. She was thinking about Tanaka's shoulder healing clean, about Akafar's headaches fading week by week, about 3 men carrying scars that could have been obituaries. And she was thinking about the 17 minutes. She was always going to think about the 17 minutes. That was the thing nobody put in commendation citations, the part that didn't resolve cleanly, didn't wrap up with the right language and a folded certificate, the part that lived permanently in the space between what happened and what almost happened, reminding her with quiet insistence that the margin between those two things was never as wide as institutional confidence suggested. She reached her station, sat down, set the commendation certificate beside her keyboard without ceremony, and put on her headset. The Intercept feeds were running. 3 active channels, 2 flagged for monitoring, 1 dormant frequency that had shown microtransmission activity in the past 6 hours. Short bursts, deliberate spacing, the kind of careful pattern that most automated systems would code as atmospheric interference and file accordingly. Maya pulled her chair in. She opened a fresh assessment document, typed the date and timestamp at the top, and began to write. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because a mission order had flagged the frequency as a priority, but because somewhere in the mountains beyond the wire, in the cold dark above some valley that hadn't been named in any briefing yet, something was moving, something was positioning, something was transmitting in careful short bursts to someone who was listening. And if there was a warning buried in that static, if there was a signal inside the noise that added up to 12 soldiers, and a road and a morning that could go either way depending on whether one person was paying close enough attention, then Maya Reyes was going to find it. Because the enemy didn't stop planning between engagements. They adapted, adjusted, and tried again with the patient persistence of people who understood that eventually, if you waited long enough and planned carefully enough, something came through the valley. She would be ready before they were. She turned up the frequency, leaned forward slightly, and listened. She never fought for recognition. She fought because 12 soldiers were going home, and she was the only one paying close enough attention to make sure they did. And